the church. So this will be odd when we get to early Christian groups. Why did these early Christian groups decide to call themselves the town assembly? Because by that time, that's the basic meaning of this term, ecclesia. And then you have other social structures of any city-state. For example, you have a theater. The theater was a place where you had performances. By the first century, when Christianity was coming around, it was not so much the place where you'd go to see necessarily high theater like Solon or Euripides or something like that. What you'd often do is go to see farces or comedies. Or sometimes the Romans liked to take a big theater and fill the central part of the theater, the cave, with water and then stage naval battles, and that kind of thing. So people would have all kinds of entertainments in the theater. But it was also where often the demos or the ecclesia would meet to have meetings and holler at each other and have big debates. So the ecclesia was the city place, and it would often meet in the theater. You also had games. So you had the gymnasium where games would take place, but also you had the hippodrome, which is in Greek, which basically just means the horse running place. This is when you have this big track. If you have wandered around different Greek cities that are dug up, some of them will have the hippodrome there, and you can see how huge they were. They had these huge stands, and it was sort of like a football stadium, except it was longer and narrower than what our football stadium would be. But it had rows of seats like that, usually made out over a hill or dug into the ground in some way. And the hippodrome, which becomes the circus in Latin, that's just the Latin translation of hippodrome, because as you'll see, Romans started adopting a lot of these, which were originally Greek institutions, into their society also. So the hippodrome is the circus in Latin. And eventually, for the Romans, this would be very popular for big chariot races. That's the big thing for the Romans later. And you'd also have baths. That is, public places, sometimes where only men could go, or sometimes women could go, or sometimes they would be mixed in some places. Or sometimes they might have men one day, women another time, and mixed around other times. So different cities had their baths differently. But the bath would be a place where, at least especially the men, would go after they'd been working out in the gymnasium, and you go and, this is where the public toilets were too. If you can't wander around any Greek city or Roman city of the ancient world without seeing the latrine. You can always find the latrine. And they always had latrines and baths, and you'd have the cold room where you'd have cold water. You'd have the tepid room where you have kind of lukewarm water, and you'd have the hot room where you have hot water. So this is where you go to relax, to make a business deal, to meet your friends, to chat, to try to have sex, try to meet somebody. All kinds of things go on in these baths. But those basic structures are part of any kind of Greek city in the ancient world. And what Alexander and his successors did was they took that basic Greek structure and they transplanted it all over the Eastern Mediterranean, whether they were in Egypt or Syria or Asia Minor or any place else, which is why you can travel right now to Turkey or Syria or Israel or Jordan or Egypt, and you can see excavations of towns, and it's remarkable how they all look so much alike because they're all inspired by this originally Greek model of the city. So that's one of the most important things about Alexander and his successors is they Hellenized the entire Eastern Mediterranean, and that meant every major city would have a certain commonality to it. It would have a certain koine to it. That is a Greek overlay over what maybe also be there, the original indigenous kind of cultures and languages. The other thing you have is religious syncretism. I didn't put that down, so just in case. The Greek word synkresis means a mixing together. When Alexander gets to Persia, let's say when he gets to Egypt, he knows that there is this god Isis, this female god Isis, that's very important. You see statues of her all over the place. Well, Alexander just followed a custom that had been taught by philosophy and other kinds of things that, they worship Isis. But Isis is sort of like Artemis. So sometimes you'd see they'd make statues of Isis look like statues of Artemis back home. Artemis is the Greek goddess of, anybody know? The hunt. See, all you guys really know your Greek and Roman mythology. That shows that you did well on your SATs, I bet, didn't you? So we'll talk a bit about what that means with the different gods and goddesses and how you learned all this in mythological courses in English in high school, but we'll get back to that. But Artemis is the goddess of the hunt. So these Greeks would say, well, we have another goddess of the hunt, and you'd find other goddesses of the hunt. Or when they'd get to Jerusalem, they see, oh, these people worship Yahweh. Well, that's just Zeus. That's just another name for Zeus. It's the same God. They just have a different name for it. Alexander took this tendency of syncretism, of mixing together different religious traditions from different places, and he used it as a self-conscious propaganda technique. He even identified himself because he started claiming divine status for himself. He went around passing out rumors that his mother had actually been impregnated by the god Apollo when he appeared as a snake in her bed. So Alexander is putting himself forward as divine. Why? This is not a Greek tradition, but it's very much a tradition in the East for kings to be considered by their people to be gods. Alexander says, well, if they can be gods, I can be a god. So he starts spreading rumors that he is divine himself. He probably even believed it. I don't think he necessarily lied about it. He probably believed that he was divine. And so he had a god father, had a human mother, and so then he would identify himself with whoever was a god in the different places. So he would identify himself as a Greek god with a Persian god. He would identify the goddess Isis with some Greek goddess. And so all the time these different gods from different places were basically all said to be simply different cultural representations, different names for what were generally the same gods all over the place. Also, though, what they would do is sometimes they wouldn't try to simply say these gods are the same. What they would just is add on more gods. They'd just say, oh, well, we got to Egypt and we found out there are a whole lot more gods than we knew about. Or we get to Syria and look at all these gods that the Syrians worship. Well, we'll just add those into our pantheon of gods too. And this is part of what ancient religion was like, is that people were not exclusive. You didn't have to worry. Just because you worshiped one god doesn't mean you couldn't worship another god or several gods or 5 gods or 100 gods. Gods knew that everybody was, they weren't particularly jealous in that sense. So this is the way people did. But what Alexander and his successors did was they made a sort of a conscious propagandistic decision to use religious syncretism to bind together their kingdoms. Now this will become a problem, obviously, when we talk about Judaism. Because Jews, the Greek rulers, were trying to do the same thing with Jewish gods and Jewish figures as they had elsewhere. And some Jews would go along with this, and some Jews would resist it. The Romans, when they came on the scene in the East, and they gradually became more and more powerful, they destroyed Corinth in a big battle in 144 BCE. Pompey was the Roman general who took over Jerusalem in 63 BCE. So the Romans were in charge of Judea from 63 BCE on. And this is very important because the Romans, as their power grew in the East, they simply moved increasingly into the Eastern Mediterranean, and they adopted the whole Greek system, the Greek world, and they didn't even try to make it non-Greek. So Romans didn't go around trying to get people in the East to speak Latin. They might put up as an official inscription in an Eastern city in Latin, but that almost always, if it was an official inscription, it would also be listed in Greek. So Romans who ruled in the East were expected to speak Greek, and by this time, all educated Roman men were expected to be able to speak Greek well, if possible. So the Romans didn't try to make the East Roman in that sense, culturally, nor did they try to change the language. Greek language, culture, and religions, different religions, and the syncretism, Greek education, the polis structure, all of these things remained in the East throughout the Roman rule of the East, all the way up until the time you had a Christian emperor with Constantine and later. But there's one thing that the Romans made even more of than the Greeks had made of, and this is the patron-client structure. This is a bit more of a distinctly Roman institution, even a legal institution, but it's important for understanding both the Roman Empire as well as early Christianity and its patron-client relations. The household structure of a Roman household was this. And I say household because our word family, which we usually take to mean the biological family, the father, the mother, the children, maybe the grandchildren, maybe the extended family, but we usually mean by it the immediate, the nuclear family with some extension. That use of the English word family, although it comes from the Latin familia, means something totally different in Latin. The Latin word familia didn't mean that biological kin group. It actually was originally used for the slaves of a household. The slaves and the freed persons of a Roman household were legally the ones who were the familia. But so when I say family, we try to avoid even talking about the Roman family because it means something so different to them than what it means to us. So I'll tend to talk about the Roman household because that's what's more meaningful sociologically when we talk about this. The Roman household was constructed like a pyramid. Imagine this is a pyramid, not a triangle. At the top of it is the head of the household, the man. The pater familias. Now, increasingly, you'll actually see this written in the New York Times or used in politics, but it comes from the Latin, and it referred to the head of the household. Pater, father, familias is the household, the family. The pater familias is the oldest man of the household. Under him is his sons, his daughters, and then at the bottom are his slaves, and here are his freedmen, freed persons. And then also you consider in some ways free people who may exist as clients. But legally, the word client in Latin refers to the freed slaves of a paterfamilias. Now, where's the wife in this picture? Notice I didn't put the wife and the mother in there. Why is that? Because legally, she's actually not part of this man's household. She remains part of the household of her father. And she's legally under the control of her father probably, or her brothers if her father is dead, or her grandfather if her grandfather is still alive. But since life expectancy in the ancient world was much less than ours, you didn't have usually several generations in these households because older people just died. The wife, though, is legally a part of her own household over here. Why did the Romans do that? That's very different from the Greeks, very different from other people in the ancient Mediterranean. Why did they want to make sure that the daughters stayed in the households of their fathers? They did this because they didn't want the upper class in Rome, who were the elite, they didn't want any one household or any small group of households to become too powerful. And if you have women marrying off into other families and then they leave the household of their fathers and they are officially and legally a household of somebody else, that may end up increasing those households that have intermarriage coming in and not so much intermarriage going out. By keeping women under the household of the men of their original family, the upper class Romans tried to balance these different households in size and importance. They didn't care about the lower class, really. The lower class didn't really count much. What they cared about, because the Roman Republic by this time was basically a bunch of very important households, wealthy men and their households. And they were the members of the Senate. They were the knight class. They were the people who ran Rome. So they didn't want one king to arise, and they didn't want a small coterie of leaders to arise. They wanted there to be some kind of balance of power among the several major households of Rome, the families of Rome. Now, slaves obviously are under the paterfamilias. When a slave is freed, and in the ancient world, in Roman Empire, most slaves were eventually freed unless they just died before long, they became a freed man. They didn't become a free man, they became a freed man. And that was legally different. So the status of slave was lowest, freed persons was next and highest in Roman law, and free people were next. But even though they became freed, they were still considered a member of this guy's household as his client and his freedman. And they owed certain duties to him. For example, they might, paterfamilia would often put a slave up in business, give a slave enough money to run a business. And that the slave could keep a lot of the income from that business for himself, and the slave could actually gather together a bit of money for himself. He couldn't legally own the money. His master legally owned everything the slave owned. But practically, and in some legal context, what they would do is they'd allow the slave the use of that money, and that's called the peculium. Now, when the slave is freed by the owner, the slave could take the peculium with him, and then he could set up his own business, but he'd still be a client of the owner because he's still officially part of his household. So this maintained even when, and why would a person free a slave? Well,